Gunfire tore through the still Florida morning, echoing across the swampy lake as federal agents unleashed their bullets at a small lakeside home. The year was 1935, and for the men who pulled the triggers, this wasn't just another raid. This was a battle that would make headlines across America. When the gun smoke cleared, the wooden house was riddled with holes, glass shattered, furniture splintered, and two lifeless bodies lay inside. One was Fred Barker, one of the most wanted criminals in the country. The other was his mother, Ma Barker, who in that moment became a legend. But legends are rarely simple. Was she the ruthless criminal mastermind the FBI painted her to be? Or was she a mother caught in a storm of myth, propaganda, and the blood-soaked crimes of her sons? That is the question that has haunted historians for decades. The official story, written quickly into newspaper headlines the very same day, declared her the most dangerous woman in America. The press described her as a cold, calculating matriarch who plotted every crime her sons committed, orchestrating kidnappings, bank robberies, and murders with a mind sharper than any gangster of her time. J. Edgar Hoover himself, head of the FBI, insisted she was the brains behind the Barker-Karpis Gang, a woman whose motherly facade concealed a mastermind's cunning. It was a story the American public was hungry to believe. The shocking image of a mother who had raised killers, who guided their hands as they pulled their triggers, and who died alongside her favorite son in a final blaze of gunfire. But as with most stories too perfect to be true, there are cracks in the narrative, and through those cracks, a very different picture begins to emerge. Imagine, for a moment, the archetype Hoover created. In the 1930s, America was reeling from the Depression. Banks had collapsed, fortunes had vanished, and ordinary families struggled just to survive. The idea of a woman who didn't just endure those hardships, but twisted them into power, who used motherhood as a cloak for crime, was irresistible. She became the villain that satisfied a public thirst for simple answers. Every story needs a monster. But when we peel away the layers, what if Ma Barker wasn't a monster at all? What if she was a woman whose love for her sons blinded her to their violence, a woman manipulated by both the men in her family and the government determined to vilify her? The truth becomes murkier when we look beyond the headlines. Alvin Karpis, the gang's most feared member, later wrote that Ma had no criminal brain whatsoever. He described her as a simple, kindly woman who cooked meals and played cards while the gang plotted robberies in the next room. He claimed the FBI had exaggerated her role to make a better story, to turn a mother into a symbol of evil. But the FBI's version, the one that portrayed her as the puppet master, was the one the world embraced. Why? Because it was easier to believe in a female criminal mastermind than to admit that perhaps the FBI had shot down an unarmed mother, guilty only of standing beside her son when his life ended. And so we stand between two competing versions of history. On one side, Ma Barker, the criminal queen, orchestrating her sons like chess pieces in a bloody game. On the other, Ma Barker, the overindulgent mother, powerless to stop the spiral of violence she had nurtured but never controlled. Which of these is true? The more you look, the more you realize that perhaps the truth is more complex than either side admits. Myths grow because they satisfy emotions, fear, outrage, fascination, and Ma Barker's myth was perfect for its time. It is no accident that this story has endured for nearly a century. A mother who raises killers forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about family, morality, and fate. Can love itself become sinister? Can devotion turn deadly when it refuses to hold its children accountable? Ma Barker's story is not just about crime. It's about identity, about the thin line between nurture and destruction, and about the ways society chooses to label women who step outside the acceptable roles of motherhood. When she was alive, she was simply a mother traveling with her sons. In death, she became a symbol of corrupted motherhood, forever remembered not for who she truly was, but for what she represented to a frightened nation. And this is why we must look closer. Beyond the gunfire, beyond the headlines, beyond the triumphant FBI statements of 1935, there are fragments of a different reality. Some neighbors remembered her as a friendly woman, quiet and unassuming. Others swore she doted on her boys with the kind of blindness only a mother's love can bring. Still others whispered that she was complicit, that she knew enough to be dangerous. The fragments never form a clean picture, and maybe they never will. But they leave us with a haunting image, a woman whose identity was written not by her own hand, but by the government, the press, and the enduring hunger for villains. So as we step into the dark and complicated life of Ma Barker, remember this: what you think you know is likely not the whole truth. She has been called the mastermind, the monster, the matriarch of crime. But she has also been described as a pawn, a scapegoat, and even a victim of history's need for a narrative. Which version do you believe? Tonight, we're going to untangle the legend, trace the rise of the Barker family from poverty to infamy, and confront the question that refuses to die. Was Ma Barker truly the mother who raised killers? Or was she simply the woman who paid the ultimate price for loving them? She was born Arizona Donnie Clark in the quiet hills of Missouri, a place where life in the late 19th century offered little more than back-breaking work and a daily struggle to get by. People would later call her Ma Barker. But back then, she was just a poor girl in a poor state, trying to carve out a future in a world that gave her very little. There was nothing glamorous about her beginnings. She grew up in a landscape of hard soil, wooden cabins, and families stretched thin by hunger and debt. Yet even in those early years, a pattern began to emerge. Friends would remember her as stubborn, proud, and protective, qualities that in another life might have made her a pillar of strength. In her life, however, they became the seeds of something far more complicated. Arizona married George Barker young, as so many women of her time did. George was a worker, not ambitious, not destined for great things. Their marriage was not one of luxury or passion. It was survival. Together they had 4 sons, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, known as Doc, and the youngest, Fred. From the moment they were born, Ma doted on them. She had little else to pour her energy into, and in the absence of wealth or comfort, her devotion to her boys became the center of her life. To her, they could do no wrong. When they misbehaved, she excused it. When they lied, she smiled. When they stole, she brushed it aside. She wanted to shield them from a world she knew could be cold and punishing, but in doing so, she may have created the very monsters who would one day make her infamous. Imagine the small house where the Barkers lived. The walls thin, the food meager, the laughter forced in between struggles to make ends meet. In that home, crime began not as an empire, but as petty mischief. Herman, the oldest, would get into scrapes with the law for stealing cars. Lloyd was caught in robberies. Doc would follow, his trouble escalating with each year. And Fred, the baby, watched them all, learning by example that defiance against authority wasn't punished but accepted. When neighbors whispered about the boys' behavior, Ma would shake her head, insisting they were good boys at heart. She defended them in front of teachers, police officers, even judges. She wore her loyalty like armor, never admitting their faults, always standing by them. But loyalty, when unchecked, can become its own kind of crime. By the 1920s, the family's name was already infamous in small towns across Missouri. The Barker boys were building reputations as thieves, swindlers, and bank robbers. Arrests piled up, sentences were handed down, but Ma's response never changed. She would show up in courtrooms, comforting her sons, shaking her head at the accusations, insisting they were being treated unfairly. To her, the world was always against them, and she, their mother, was their only defender. And so her identity fused entirely with theirs. The more criminal they became, the more she sank into the role of their protector. Some said she spoiled them. Others said she poisoned them with her refusal to discipline. But what's certain is this: every time she excused a crime, every time she denied the truth, the Barker boys slid further down the path that would lead to bloodshed. And yet, it's too easy to blame her entirely. Poverty in Missouri during those years was suffocating. Opportunities for young men were limited, and the lure of easy money was everywhere. Cars were becoming more common, banks more vulnerable, and law enforcement often weak or corrupt. To steal a car or rob a small-town bank was to taste power in a world where power was otherwise out of reach. The Barkers were not alone in this. Across the country, crime was on the rise. But what made them different was the way their mother stood by them, not in ignorance but in deliberate loyalty. She was not blind to their actions. She simply chose to protect them from consequences. And protection can sometimes be the most dangerous form of love. The paradox of Ma Barker begins here. On one hand, she was the classic image of a mother in hardship, cooking meals from scraps, patching clothes, raising children in a house without privilege. On the other, she became complicit in shaping men who lived outside the law. Each boy found his way into crime, and each boy returned to her, knowing she would never turn them away. Home was not a place of correction. It was a sanctuary for criminals in the making. Ma's house became their refuge, and in time, their criminal headquarters. By the time the youngest, Fred, was old enough to make his mark, the Barkers were no longer a struggling family, but a family bound together by defiance, rebellion, and the thrill of crime. It's here that we begin to see the shift from struggling mother to matriarch of crime. Whether she wanted it or not, Ma Barker was no longer just raising sons. She was raising outlaws, and she seemed to embrace the role. Some said she relished being surrounded by her boys, no matter what they did. Others argued she was simply too weak to stop them. Whatever the truth, the Barker household had transformed into something darker. A place where lawlessness was normalized and where loyalty to family came before loyalty to any rule of society. Herman, the eldest, was already wanted for bank robberies by the early 1920s. Lloyd was in and out of prison. Doc and Fred followed closely behind, and every time, Ma was there. She would cook for them, provide shelter, give them money when she had it. The world saw her as an indulgent mother who loved her sons too much. But soon, whispers began to spread. Maybe she wasn't just indulging them. Maybe she was encouraging them. Maybe this wasn't blind love, but deliberate partnership. It was the kind of suspicion that would one day grow into legend. Looking back, it is easy to wonder, was there a moment when she could have changed everything? Could she have turned one of them away? Could she have insisted they face their punishments? Could she have broken the cycle before it consumed all of them? Or was it already too late, the moment she decided her loyalty was unconditional? History rarely gives us clear answers, but the questions hang heavy over her story. For every mother who sees their child slip into bad decisions, Ma Barker's life is a chilling reminder of what can happen when protection becomes permissiveness and when love refuses to confront truth. By the time the Barker name became synonymous with crime, Ma's identity was fully entwined with theirs. She was no longer Arizona Donnie Clark. She was Ma Barker, mother of criminals, the woman who never said no, the woman who seemed to choose her son's survival over society's rules. Whether she was complicit or not, her legend was already being written, and the world was beginning to notice. By the late 1920s, the Barker boys had moved well past petty crimes. They were no longer just reckless young men testing boundaries in small Missouri towns. They had become hardened criminals, each arrest sharpening their skills, each prison sentence adding to their reputation. The family that had once been defined by poverty was now defined by crime. And into this dark transformation stepped another figure, Alvin Karpis, a man whose name would one day strike fear across America. With him, the Barker sons built one of the most feared gangs in history. And standing in the center of it all was their mother, the woman newspapers would later call the godmother of crime. Alvin Karpis was not like the Barkers. Born in Canada, he grew up with his own share of hardship, drifting into crime early in life. By the time he met the Barker boys, he had already built a reputation as a ruthless thief and a man with ice in his veins. He wasn't reckless. He was calculated, the kind of criminal who thought 3 steps ahead while others acted on impulse. Where the Barker boys had muscle, Karpis had strategy. Together, they were combustible, a combination of force and intellect that made them uniquely dangerous. And in this strange union, Ma Barker found herself not merely a bystander, but an ever-present figure, traveling with her sons and Karpis as the gang grew bolder, bloodier, and more infamous. The Barker-Karpis Gang was unlike any other of the Depression era. This wasn't Bonnie and Clyde, young lovers blazing a doomed trail of robbery and romance. Nor was it Dillinger's gang, which played up a kind of twisted Robin Hood mythology. The Barkers and Karpis had no interest in charm or spectacle. They were brutal, they were efficient, and they were relentless. They didn't just rob banks, they specialized in kidnappings, targeting the wealthy and powerful, demanding ransoms so high they made national headlines. Their violence was not random, it was precise, aimed at shaking fear into both the underworld and the public. The FBI, still building its national reputation under J. Edgar Hoover, considered them among the most dangerous criminals alive. Their crimes read like a ledger of terror. In 1933, they kidnapped William Ham Jr., the heir to Ham's Brewery in Minnesota. The ransom was a staggering $100,000, an unimaginable fortune during the Great Depression. Ham was released alive, but the message was clear. The Barker-Karpis Gang had elevated crime into a business, and no one with money was safe. The very next year, they kidnapped banker Edward Brem, demanding an even higher ransom of $200,000. Newspapers across the country carried the story, splashing the gang's name in bold print, making them household villains. Every successful kidnapping fed the legend. Every ransom paid fueled their next move. And through it all, Ma Barker was there, cooking meals, playing cards, and allegedly offering advice. Was she the mastermind? Or was she simply the one constant presence in a sea of violence and chaos? It is here that the mythology around Ma begins to solidify. To outsiders, it seemed impossible that a mother could travel with such a gang and not be involved in its crimes. How could she not know? How could she not participate? But those who knew her painted a different picture. Karpis himself later scoffed at the idea of her being their strategist. He claimed she didn't have the brain for crime, that she was little more than a housekeeper, a woman who enjoyed being with her sons and pretended not to see the blood on their hands. Yet the FBI insisted otherwise. To Hoover and his agents, Ma Barker was the glue that held the gang together, a manipulative matriarch who used her maternal influence to keep the men loyal and disciplined. It was a version of events that served their narrative well, but the truth was more complicated. The gang's operations spread across multiple states, their movements shadowed by law enforcement and rival criminals alike. They used safe houses, rented under false names, to hide between jobs. They invested their ransom money in guns, cars, and bribes. Shootouts became inevitable, and with each confrontation, their notoriety grew. For ordinary Americans reeling under the economic despair of the Depression, stories of the gang were both terrifying and thrilling. Here were criminals who defied the banks that had ruined so many lives, criminals who seemed untouchable despite the growing power of the FBI. But while the public watched in awe, the Barkers and Karpis lived in paranoia, always moving, always waiting for the inevitable knock at the door. In those hideouts, Ma Barker's presence was constant. She played cards with the men, cooked meals to keep them fed, and offered comfort when tension grew too heavy. Some said she provided cover, a harmless older woman who made the gang appear less threatening to landlords or neighbors. Others believed she was more than that, whispering advice, listening to plans, and occasionally giving her approval. The FBI seized on this image, portraying her as the puppet master. But the testimonies of those inside the gang paint her as a mother unwilling to let go of her sons, clinging to them even as their lives descended into lawlessness. In many ways, her greatest crime may have been her refusal to walk away. Still, whether mastermind or matriarch, her presence mattered. The men trusted her. They brought her along even when it made no tactical sense. She was in the houses, at the hideouts, sharing in the spoils of their crimes. To the world outside, that made her guilty. To the men inside, it made her indispensable. And as the crimes escalated, so too did the manhunt. Hoover's FBI was determined to prove its dominance, to show America that no gang was beyond its reach. The Barker-Karpis Gang became a prime target, not just because of their brutality, but because they symbolized everything Hoover wanted to defeat: disorganized chaos, violent crime, and disrespect for federal authority. The kidnappings had made them rich, but also reckless. Each ransom filled their pockets but also drew more attention. By 1934, the FBI had expanded its power, armed with new federal kidnapping laws and a growing reputation as the nation's defender. Hoover needed victories, and the Barkers provided the perfect villains. Posters with their names and faces were plastered across the country. Rewards were offered for information. And while Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde stole headlines with their drama, tick deaths, Hoover was playing a longer game, waiting for the moment he could stage his own grand triumph. That triumph would come, he promised, in the form of Ma Barker and her sons. But before that final act, the gang continued to move, their crimes leaving scars across the Midwest. Shootouts with police left bodies in the streets. Ransom money was exchanged in clandestine meetings, each handoff another story for the papers. For Ma, this life became her reality. Whether she encouraged it or simply endured it, she was in the thick of it, a mother surrounded by killers, a woman whose devotion had crossed into complicity. To the FBI, she was proof that even family could be corrupted by crime. To the public, she was a spectacle, an older woman at the heart of America's deadliest gang. As the months passed, the circle around them tightened. Informants whispered, safe houses grew riskier. The FBI moved closer, tracking their every move. The legend of the gang was reaching its peak, but so too was its collapse. And at the center of that storm, Ma Barker held fast to her sons, refusing to abandon them, even as the weight of their crimes dragged them all toward an inevitable end. The family had started as poor Missourians trying to survive. They had become criminals, then fugitives, then legends. And soon, they would become something else entirely. Martyrs of a narrative written not by themselves, but by the government determined to destroy them. The Barker-Karpis Gang had made its mark. They had terrified a nation, challenged the FBI, and left a trail of blood and broken lives in their wake. But their story was not yet finished. For as their power waned, Hoover's need for a spectacular victory grew. And in the clash between a family bound by loyalty and a government bent on triumph, Ma Barker would become either the criminal queen Hoover claimed she was, or the scapegoat that history never quite stopped questioning. When the bullets stopped flying in Florida that morning in 1935, the FBI had more than just 2 bodies in a riddled lakeside house. They had a story, and stories were power. In that moment, J. Edgar Hoover recognized the opportunity before him. For years, he had fought to legitimize the FBI, to transform it from a bureaucratic agency into a national force. What better way to do that than to claim victory over the most dangerous gang in America, led by none other than a criminal mastermind who happened to be a mother? It was shocking, sensational, and perfectly tailored to capture the public's imagination. Overnight, Ma Barker became not only notorious, but symbolic. She was no longer simply the mother of 4 criminals. She was painted as the brain behind them all, the woman who had orchestrated every robbery, every kidnapping, every life lost. But was that the truth? The more we dig into the accounts of the time, the more the story begins to fracture. Alvin Karpis, the last surviving member of the Barker-Karpis Gang, laughed at the suggestion that Ma had any hand in strategy. He insisted she had no criminal intellect, no taste for violence, no role beyond being the ever-present mother who happened to live with them. The old woman couldn't plan breakfast, he scoffed, dismissing the FBI's claim that she was a criminal genius. According to him, she cooked, she cleaned, she played cards, and she clung to her boys. That was all. The idea that she was secretly masterminding multi-state operations was, in his words, absurd. And yet, this absurdity became the narrative America embraced. Why would Hoover, a man obsessed with control, push such a story? The answer lies not only in power, but in psychology. In the 1930s, America was grappling with the chaos of the Depression and the violence of rising organized crime. Families were broken, fathers unemployed, and fear ran through the veins of society. For Hoover, projecting the FBI as the solution to that fear was essential. By elevating Ma Barker into a villainous mastermind, he created a villain that justified his agency's existence. The FBI wasn't just battling faceless thugs, it was defeating an evil matriarch, the embodiment of corrupted motherhood. It gave the Bureau moral authority, something far more potent than mere firepower. And there was something even deeper at play. Women in crime stories of the era were rarely neutral. They were either victims, helpless and tragic, or they were temptresses, masterminds, and corrupters of men. Hoover understood this cultural script, and he weaponized it. By presenting Ma Barker as the archetypal bad mother, he tapped into primal fears, the idea that even the sacred bond of family could be twisted into something deadly. If a mother could become a gangster's mastermind, then no social institution was safe. It was shocking, scandalous, and irresistibly newsworthy. But here lies the tension. For every FBI statement declaring her a ruthless strategist, there were testimonies that contradicted it. Former neighbors remembered her as doting, sometimes clueless, always defending her boys but never hinting at intelligence in crime. Even her surviving son Lloyd, who lived into the 1960s, maintained that Ma had no hand in the gang's operations. According to him, she was simply too close to her sons to abandon them. She followed them into the life they chose, not as a commander, but as a mother unwilling to let go. History, however, often prefers a dramatic tale over a complicated one, and so Hoover's narrative overshadowed the quieter voices. The press, hungry for sensational copy during the Depression, amplified Hoover's version. Headlines branded her the bloody godmother, the brains of the Barker Gang. Articles painted lurid pictures of her calling shots, approving targets, manipulating her sons into ever more dangerous crimes. The image stuck, reinforced in pulp magazines and later Hollywood films. To the public, it made sense. How else could four brothers hold together such a violent empire unless someone cunning, kept them united? The FBI encouraged this speculation, feeding the press just enough detail to let imaginations run wild. Every detail of the Ocklawaha shootout was framed to reinforce the myth. Ma firing back at agents, Ma refusing to surrender, Ma dying with a machine gun in her hands. The reality, of course, is less certain. Some reports suggest she never fired a shot. Others claim she was found unarmed. But those accounts were drowned in the tidal wave of Hoover's carefully curated story. And so the legend took root. Ma Barker, the frail, aging woman who may never have so much as pulled a trigger, became the poster child for maternal monstrosity. It is worth pausing here to ask, why did people believe it so readily? The answer lies in the comfort of clarity. A world in chaos craves explanations. People wanted to understand how ordinary families could give birth to criminals so vicious. The idea of a manipulative mother provided an answer. She wasn't just unlucky or indulgent. She was sinister, a dark architect shaping her sons into killers. Believing this made the world less random, less frightening. It turned crime into a family drama with a villain at its core, and villains make us feel safer because they can be defeated. But the cost of this narrative was truth itself. If Ma Barker was innocent of the charges of mastermind, then her death was not only tragic but unjust. She meka, I have been guilty of blind loyalty, of failing as a parent to set boundaries, of enabling through denial. But was that enough to brand her as the most dangerous criminal brain of the decade? Was that enough to justify turning her into a legend of villainy? To Hoover, it was more than enough, because in vilifying her, he secured the image of the FBI as a heroic defender of American families. By destroying the monster, he made himself the savior. The myth of Ma Barker still lingers because it speaks to something deeper in us. We are drawn to the contrast between mother and monster, between nurturer and destroyer. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How much responsibility does a parent bear for the crimes of their children? Can love itself become toxic when it refuses to confront truth? And most haunting of all, if Ma Barker had not been vilified, if she had been remembered as a mother who simply followed her sons into ruin, would her story have endured at all? Legends, after all, survive because they shock us, because they fit the narratives we want to believe. What makes this myth even more striking is how enduring it has been. Even decades later, films and books recycle Hoover's version of events, rarely questioning whether the criminal mastermind label was ever earned. The truth is messy, nuanced, filled with contradictions. But the myth is clean, powerful, and easy to retell. Hoover knew this. He built his career on controlling stories as much as on catching criminals. In Ma Barker, he found the perfect canvas for his agenda. And in accepting his story, America embraced not the woman herself, but the symbol he created. So we are left with two Ma Barkers, the one who lived Perhaps a flawed mother whose love blinded her to her son's violence, and the one who died in myth, a mastermind who never existed outside of headlines. Which is the real one? Maybe both, maybe neither. But what is certain is that history remembers the legend more than the woman, and in that distortion lies the greatest crime of all. For in turning her into a monster, the truth of her life, the human complexities, the contradictions, the tragic blindness, was lost, replaced by a caricature that served someone else's ambition. And as we turn toward the violent crescendo of her story, the standoff in Florida that ended her life, we must ask ourselves, what happens when a person's identity is written not by their own actions, but by the stories others tell about them? For Ma Barker, that question was answered in bullets, in headlines, and in a myth that still haunts the American imagination. The house stood by the water, quiet and unremarkable, its wooden frame weathered by Florida humidity. To anyone passing by, it looked like nothing more than a rented lakeside cottage, a retreat for a family seeking rest. But behind its walls in January of 1935, tension rippled like a live wire. Inside, Fred Barker and his mother, Ma, lived in the shadow of constant pursuit. They knew the net was closing. The FBI was no longer fumbling in the dark. Hoover's men had maps, informants, and momentum. Every safe house was temporary, every dawn a gamble. Yet in those final days, the Barkers must have allowed themselves a flicker of denial, the illusion that they could escape the tightening grip of the law. They had been running for years. Perhaps they believed they could keep running forever. But history had decided otherwise. The story of that standoff begins not with the sound of gunfire, but with whispers. The FBI had tracked them to Ocklawaha through a string of clues, piecing together the movements of the Barker-Karpis Gang. Agents received word of two suspicious tenants at the lakeside cottage, living quietly but paying in cash, drawing just enough attention to stir suspicion. Local gossip, a landlord's hunch, and Hoover's hunger for a decisive victory converged. When agents surrounded the house on the morning of January 16th, they were not merely looking to arrest fugitives. They were preparing to stage a spectacle, one that would justify years of pursuit and feed the legend Hoover was determined to create. As dawn broke, the stillness of the lake mirrored the stillness inside the house. Fred and Ma awoke to the sound of cars rolling in, doors slamming, the crunch of boots against soil. From every angle, agents took position, rifles raised, nerves taut. What came next was 4 hours of relentless gunfire, a storm of bullets that turned a quiet home into a battlefield. Agents shouted demands for surrender, their voices carrying across the water. Inside, Ma and Fred refused, or perhaps they never even heard over the roar of gunfire. The accounts differ, and it is in those differences that myth was born. Imagine being there in that moment. Shattered glass exploding inward as bullets ripped through windows, plaster flying as walls splintered, the sound of automatic weapons filling the air, echoing across the swamp like thunder. Fred Barker, the youngest of the brothers, returned fire, determined to go down fighting. But what about Ma? Did she pick up a gun? Did she fire back? The FBI swore she did, claiming she was armed with a Tommy gun, spraying bullets with the same fury as her son. Yet other accounts suggest she was unarmed, hiding, perhaps clutching a Bible as agents later claimed they found beside her body. Was she a combatant, or was she simply trapped in a cage of bullets she had no power to stop? The FBI's version of events was clear. They announced to the press that Ma Barker had been killed in battle, not as collateral, but as a combatant. Hoover declared that she had been the most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain of the last decade. Her death was painted as justice served. Yet eyewitnesses raised doubts. Locals who watched from a distance swore they never saw her fire a weapon. Agents admitted later that they couldn't be certain which shots came from whom. But in the theater of Hoover's narrative, certainty was unnecessary. What mattered was that the matriarch of America's most feared gang had died in a blaze of gunfire, and the FBI had prevailed. The siege lasted hours. Neighbors gathered on porches and down by the road, drawn by the thunderous noise, watching smoke rise from the cottage as bullets continued to fly. For the Bureau, this was not simply an operation, it was a demonstration. The sheer volume of gunfire, thousands of rounds unleashed, was not only about neutralizing fugitives, but about spectacle, about making a statement that the FBI was the nation's shield against chaos. When the firing finally ceased, when silence returned, and the agents stormed the wrecked home, the scene inside was one of devastation. Fred's body lay riddled with bullets. Ma's was nearby, lifeless. The house was shredded, every wall scarred, furniture destroyed. 2 lives had ended, but in their place a legend had been born. From the moment the smoke cleared, Hoover seized control of the story. Photographs of the bullet-riddled house were splashed across newspapers nationwide. Journalists called it the climax of a reign of terror. They wrote of the elderly woman who had commanded her sons like soldiers, a mother who had turned her love into a weapon. The image was lurid, sensational, and unforgettable. It satisfied the public's craving for drama and closure. It offered a villain neatly slain, a story with a clean ending. But reality rarely ends so neatly. Questions lingered, and they still linger today. Did Ma Barker ever truly fire a gun in that house? Or was she executed by history as much as by bullets? The FBI maintained their version with confidence, but cracks in the narrative surfaced quickly. One of the most striking came from Barker-Karpis, the last of the gang still alive after the dust settled. He insisted Ma had no part in strategy, no role in violence, and certainly no hand in that final gunfight. To him, the idea of her holding a Tommy gun was laughable. He described her as sitting quietly while her sons made their plans, a woman who cooked meals and played cards but had no interest in crime itself. If Karpis was telling the truth, then the FBI's account was not only exaggerated, but deliberately fabricated to transform her death into a heroic victory. Other inconsistencies deepened the doubt. Some reports suggested that when agents entered the house, they found Ma lying near her bed, a Bible at her side, not a weapon. The image of an elderly woman killed while clutching scripture is a very different image than the machine gun-wielding matriarch Hoover described. Yet that softer version never caught on because it lacked the drama Hoover needed. A Bible does not justify 4 hours of relentless fire. A Bible does not crown the FBI as conquering heroes. A machine gun does. And so the myth of Ma Barker, armed and dangerous to her last breath, became the one America remembered. The standoff at Ocklawaha was not just an end, it was a beginning. It was the beginning of Ma's transformation into folklore, the moment her humanity was stripped away and replaced by a symbol. To the FBI, she was the ultimate villain. To Hollywood, she was irresistible material. To the public, she became a cautionary tale about motherhood twisted into monstrosity. And yet, beneath all the myth, there remains the image of an aging woman caught in a storm she may never have truly controlled. Was she guilty of enabling her sons? Undoubtedly. Was she guilty of masterminding their crimes? The evidence suggests otherwise. But history is written by those who win the gunfight, and Hoover's FBI won that morning on the lake. Think about what it means for a life to end this way. Surrounded, outgunned, vilified, and remembered not for who you truly were, but for who others needed you to be. Ma Barker may have been many things: indulgent, blind, complicit, loyal to a fault. But the narrative that sealed her fate painted her as something she may never have been. It turned a flawed mother into a criminal genius. It turned an ambiguous figure into a monster. And in doing so, it gave Hoover exactly what he wanted. Proof that his bureau was indispensable. Proof that he could slay not just criminals, but legends. The Ocklawaha standoff is remembered as a triumph of law enforcement, but to see it only as that is to miss the deeper tragedy. 2 people died, but one of them was executed twice, once by bullets and once by history. The real Ma Barker, whoever she was buried under the rubble of that house. In her place rose the legend of the mother who raised killers, a legend more enduring than the truth, because legends feed our fears and our fascinations. Legends survive not because they are accurate, but because they satisfy the stories we want to believe. And so, the image lingers, a small house by a Florida lake riddled with holes, the bodies of a son and his mother inside. To the FBI, it was proof of their power. To the newspapers, it was front-page drama. To history, it became a story of maternal corruption and justice served. But for those who look closer, it remains a puzzle, a story where every answer breeds another question. Did she fire a gun, or didn't she? Was she the mastermind, or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? The truth lies somewhere in the haze of smoke and shattered glass, a truth perhaps forever obscured by the myth Hoover needed more than the facts themselves. The standoff at Ocklawaha is not just a moment in crime history. It is a mirror. It reflects how stories are shaped, how truth bends under power, and how identity can be stolen by narrative. For Ma Barker, the gunfire ended her life. But the story written about her ensured she would never rest. She became not Arizona Donnie Clark, not simply a flawed mother, but Ma Barker, the woman who, in legend, raised killers and died as one herself. When the smoke cleared from that lakeside house in Ocklawaha, the FBI wasted no time. They did not simply remove the bodies of Fred and Ma Barker. They carried out something far more enduring. They took control of the story. Newspapers received photographs almost instantly. Grainy images of the bullet-riddled cottage, captions that declared the bloody godmother of crime was dead at last. Hoover's men briefed reporters with confidence, describing a fierce standoff, a mother who fought to the bitter end, a matriarch who had orchestrated a decade of crime and violence. Within days, the name Ma Barker was no longer just a mother's nickname. It had become an icon of evil. But stories told in triumph rarely reveal the full truth. What happened after Ocklawaha was not simply the closing of a criminal chapter, but the birth of a legend carefully sculpted by propaganda, by pulp writers eager for scandal, and by a public ready to consume the tale of a mother-turned-monster. In death, Ma Barker was stripped of nuance. She was no longer the complicated woman who had once been Arizona Donnie Clark, the struggling wife and indulgent mother. She was transformed into something larger, darker, and infinitely more marketable. The newspapers led the charge. They described her as a cunning strategist, a woman who had manipulated her sons into violence, a mastermind pulling the strings of kidnappings and robberies. Writers indulged in lurid details, embellishing accounts of her supposed leadership, portraying her as cold and calculating, even mocking her as an old crone with the mind of a general. The press painted her death as justice, a victory for the American family against the corruption of motherhood gone wrong. For readers struggling through the Depression, the story was irresistible. It offered a villain to hate, a cautionary tale to discuss over dinner tables, a reminder that even the most sacred bond, that of a mother and her children, could turn into something monstrous. But behind those sensational headlines, contradictions simmered. Alvin Karpis, still alive after the raid, openly rejected the narrative. In his later memoirs, he wrote bluntly that Ma had no criminal intelligence whatsoever. He claimed she didn't even understand their plans most of the time, that she was tolerated by the gang because she was harmless, a mother figure who cooked meals and played cards, not someone capable of orchestrating a kidnapping. Lloyd Barker, her surviving son, echoed similar sentiments, insisting that his mother had never been the brain behind their operations. Yet their voices were drowned out by the louder, more thrilling tale Hoover was feeding the public. And Hoover's FBI had every incentive to keep the myth alive. For years, Hoover had been building the Bureau's reputation, struggling to prove its worth to politicians and the American people. The Great Depression had created a surge of outlaws who made headlines. John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Pretty Boy Floyd. Each one chipped away at the illusion of order. Each one made the Bureau look weak. Hoover needed a definitive victory, a symbol of the FBI's power to protect the nation from chaos. Ma Barker gave him exactly that. By painting her as a criminal mastermind, Hoover made her defeat a triumph worth celebrating, a story that showcased the FBI as not only competent, but heroic. The propaganda didn't stop with the papers. Pulp magazines, always hungry for scandal, took Hoover's narrative and amplified it. They depicted Ma as a manipulative witch-like figure, gleefully sending her sons into danger, reveling in bloodshed. Illustrations showed her with cold eyes, clutching weapons, draped in shadow. These stories weren't about accuracy. They were about drama, and drama sold. For a public drowning in hardship, reading about a monstrous mother brought a strange comfort. She was worse than their troubles, darker than their despair. By turning her into an archetype, society gave itself a villain it could safely condemn. Hollywood soon followed. Films of the 1940s and beyond turned Ma Barker into a grotesque caricature. In some depictions, she was shown as domineering and cruel, a tyrant over her sons. In others, she was portrayed almost as a parody, a symbol of how far maternal instincts could be twisted. The truth of her life, her poverty, her loyalty, her blindness, was irrelevant. What mattered was the myth, and the myth was box office gold. Every retelling further divorced her from reality, until the Ma Barker remembered by history was less a woman and more a symbol of corrupted motherhood. But what does it mean to demonize a mother so completely? On one level, it satisfied a cultural hunger. In a time when women were expected to embody nurturing purity, the idea of a mother who raised killers was shocking enough to stick. It inverted the most sacred role in society, turning comfort into cruelty, love into violence. By framing Ma Barker as the anti-mother, the FBI and the press created a figure whose very existence justified fear and demanded punishment. On another level, it gave Hoover a perfect foil. By destroying her, he positioned himself and his bureau as defenders of morality, protectors of family values in a time of uncertainty. And yet, this demonization leaves us with uncomfortable questions. Was she truly evil? Or was she simply a woman who failed to control her sons? Was she a mastermind? Or was she a scapegoat sacrificed on the altar of propaganda? History rarely allows for such shades of gray, but the evidence suggests she was more enabler than architect, more victim of loyalty than villain of genius. To admit that, however, would strip the FBI's story of its triumph. And so the myth survived, leaving us to wrestle with the possibility that an ordinary woman was turned into a monster to suit the needs of power. The aftermath of Ocklawaha was not just about reputation, it was about legacy. The Barker family name was forever branded with infamy. Their crimes, their deaths, their mother's vilification became part of the tapestry of Depression-era America. A story told again and again to reinforce certain truths, whether or not those truths were real. For decades, children would hear the name Ma Barker not as history, but as folklore, as a cautionary tale, as proof that evil can exist even in the guise of motherhood. The woman herself was gone, but the shadow she cast, or rather the shadow others cast for her, loomed larger on life. This is the tragedy of Ma Barker's aftermath. She did not get to define her own story. She did not get the chance to defend herself or to reveal who she truly was. Her identity was written by bullets, headlines, and Hoover's ambition, and in that rewriting, the complexity of her humanity was erased. She became a caricature, frozen in time as the mother who raised killers. But perhaps the greatest crime of all was not what she did, but how history remembered her. How she was reduced to a symbol, her real life buried under layers of exaggeration and myth. As we look back now, we must ask ourselves why this story mattered so much. Why was it easier to believe in a monstrous mother than to accept the possibility of a mother who was simply too weak, too indulgent, too blinded by love to stop her sons? Perhaps because villains are cleaner than failures. Monsters can be slain. But weakness, blindness, and tragedy are harder to confront. They remind us that evil is not always grand or cunning. It can be ordinary. It can be born of small failures repeated over years, of loyalty misplaced, of love untempered by discipline. That story is less satisfying, but it is also more human. And so, in the aftermath of Ocklawaha, Ma Barker became something she never was in life. A legend, a monster, a name spoken with fear and fascination. Her story was consumed, twisted, and retold until the woman herself disappeared. But legends do not die. They linger, reshaping themselves to fit the needs of each new generation. And in Ma Barker's case, the legend has always been more powerful than the truth. Time has a way of reshaping memory, sanding down the edges of fact, until all that remains is legend. For Ma Barker, the decades after her death were less about the life she lived and more about the story others told about her. She had no chance to defend herself, no way to contradict the words "ho" over-etched into the record. And so, in the years that followed, her name drifted further from truth and deeper into folklore. She became more than a person. She became a symbol, a shadow that still lingers whenever we speak of mothers, crime, and the uneasy bond between love and destruction. Her legacy is tangled, a knot of contradictions that resists untangling. To the FBI, she remains a triumph, the embodiment of a criminal mastermind destroyed by federal power. To Hollywood, she has been a character rewritten again and again, sometimes as a grotesque caricature of maternal evil, sometimes as a tragic figure undone by her loyalty. To the public, she lingers as a cautionary tale, proof that even motherhood can be corrupted. And yet, when you strip away the embellishments, the pulp fiction, the propaganda, what remains is far less certain. Was she truly the woman who raised killers, or was she simply remembered that way because it made a better story? In many ways, her legacy mirrors America's uneasy relationship with crime itself. We are drawn to stories of outlaws and villains, not because we admire them, but because they allow us to test the boundaries of morality from the safety of distance. Ma Barker's story fascinates not because of what she did, but because of what she represents. She is the inversion of the sacred. A mother is meant to protect, to nurture, to guide. To imagine that same role twisted into something destructive unsettles us in ways few other stories can. It forces us to question the very foundation of family. Can love become dangerous? Can devotion blind us so deeply that it becomes complicity? These questions are timeless, and Ma Barker embodies them more powerfully than anyone else in American criminal history. Her image has been used in countless ways over the decades. In films, she is often portrayed as domineering, shrill, manipulative, the iron-willed matriarch who bent her sons to her will. In other portrayals, she is seen as pathetic, clinging to her boys because she had nothing else, swept up in crimes she never fully understood. Both depictions, in their own ways, are exaggerations, but exaggerations have power. They keep her story alive, ensuring that her name still provokes fascination long after her death. Few criminals of her time have remained so firmly etched into cultural memory. Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Pretty Boy Floyd, each has their legend. Yet Ma Barker is different. She carries with her not only the weight of crime, but the heavy symbolism of motherhood turned monstrous. What makes her legacy even more haunting is the uncertainty that lingers. The FBI's claim that she was a mastermind has never been proven with hard evidence. No documents, no plans, no orders trace back to her hand. What does exist are memoirs, testimonies, and recollections suggesting she was more of a passive figure, loyal but uninvolved. Alvin Karpis's dismissal of her as someone who couldn't plan breakfast cuts sharply against Hoover's grand claims. And yet, Hoover's words endured while Karpis's were buried in the margins. Why? Because Hoover's version gave America the story it wanted, a villain who could be slain, a legend that could justify the FBI's rise. In this way, Ma Barker's legacy is less about her and more about power. Power to shape narratives, power to dictate history, power to decide how someone will be remembered. She died not only in a hail of bullets, but in the crossfire of myth and ambition. And in that sense, she represents something larger than herself. She is a case study in how propaganda works, how stories are crafted to serve institutions, and how individuals can be erased by the legends built around them. The woman she was, poor, loyal, indulgent, flawed, was lost, replaced by a figure designed to terrify, to entertain, to reinforce authority. And yet, we cannot deny her role in her sons' lives. To absolve her entirely would be dishonest. She raised them without boundaries, excused their every fault, defended them against all consequence. She may not have planned their crimes, but she created the soil in which they grew. That failure, the failure to guide, to discipline, to confront, was real. It is part of why her story endures, because it strikes at a universal fear. What happens when love becomes weakness? When devotion blinds us to truth? When family loyalty overrides justice? In this sense, Ma Barker remains both guilty and innocent, both victim and enabler, both mother and monster. The public fascination with her has never been about facts. It has always been about identity. She represents the possibility that the roles we consider sacred can be corrupted. She is the nightmare version of motherhood, a reminder that even the most protective bond can warp into something destructive. And because of that, her story resonates beyond the details of kidnappings and bank robberies. It becomes a meditation on family, morality, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. As time passed, historians began to challenge the FBI's narrative, peeling back the layers of exaggeration. Some argued that Hoover deliberately inflated her role to justify the siege at Ocklawaha. Others suggested that her demonization was a reflection of society's fear of women stepping outside traditional roles. In a world where women were expected to be nurturing and submissive, Turning one into a criminal mastermind was both shocking and useful. It reinforced social boundaries by showing what happened when they were broken. But even as scholars were, cared to restore nuance to her story, the myth refused to die. Myths rarely do. They are too simple, too dramatic, too powerful. So who, then, was Ma Barker? Perhaps the best answer is that she was both less and more than the stories told about her. Less, because she likely never wielded the power attributed to her. More, because her life and death became a canvas onto which America projected its fears, its prejudices, and its fascination with crime. She became a mirror reflecting not only the violence of her sons, but the anxieties of her nation. And that, in the end, is why her name still echoes when so many others have faded. Her legacy is also deeply personal. For anyone who has ever struggled with the weight of family loyalty, her story raises painful questions. How far should devotion go? At what point does protection become complicity? Is it better to stand by those we love no matter what, or to draw a line even if it means breaking that bond? Ma Barker's life does not give us clear answers, but it forces us to confront those questions. And perhaps that is why her story endures, because it speaks to dilemmas we all carry, dilemmas about love, loyalty, and responsibility. In the end, Ma Barker exists in two forms: the woman she may have been and the myth she became. The woman was poor, flawed, fiercely devoted to her sons, blinded by that devotion, unable or unwilling to stop them. The myth was the mastermind, the monster, the anti-mother who raised killers and died with a machine gun in her hands. Between those two versions lies the space where truth usually resides, murky and unresolved. And perhaps that is where she belongs, not neatly defined but suspended in ambiguity, reminding us that history is rarely as clear as we want it to be. So was she a mother or a monster? The answer is both and neither. She was a mother whose failures had monstrous consequences. She was a woman whose life was hijacked by propaganda, whose death was used to write a legend, whose identity was transformed into a cautionary tale. And in that transformation lies the final tragedy, that the person she truly was will never be fully known. She has been buried not only by the bullets of Oklawaha, but by the weight of the stories told about her. And now, nearly a century later, we are still asking the same question, still debating, still caught between myth and reality. That is the power of her legacy. It refuses to die because it touches something primal in us, something that goes beyond crime and punishment. It forces us to see the fragility of family, the dangers of love untempered by truth, and the ease with which history can turn a human being into a symbol. So I leave you with this. Do you believe Ma Barker was truly the woman who raised killers, the dark genius Hoover proclaimed her to be? Or do you believe she was a pawn, a scapegoat, a mother whose only crime was her refusal to let go of her sons? The answer you choose says as much about you as it does about her. For in the end, legends are not only about the people they describe, they are about the people who keep them alive,